Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. Last week's crime report dealt with the abduction and torture of 4 black children by 2 white supremacists who, quote-unquote, adopted them. These 2 demonic reprobates tortured those children in 2 different states, and the authorities in both the state of Washington and West Virginia did absolutely nothing about it, despite knowing all about it. Like so many others of these crimes the white corporate media doesn't cover, these criminals were living out in rural areas where the alleged law enforcement are sheriffs. And as I've documented for you, this is where the worst crimes take place because the people out there know that the sheriffs are on code to allow them to do whatever they want, especially if they're harming a black person. As I detailed for you last week, these 2 degenerates were torturing those black children. The neighbors called the sheriffs on them multiple times, and the sheriffs had come out numerous times and took the side of the abductors. And even with the arrests, no one is talking about punishing the sheriffs for refusing to do their jobs. No one's talking about taking their law enforcement certifications. Nothing. So this was not a case of the sheriffs having failed. This was a case of the system working exactly the way it was designed. And this week's crime report answers the question, why is it that these degenerates were able to get away with enslaving black children for so long right in front of law enforcement in 2 different states? Why is it that these sheriffs are just so eager to allow so much criminality? Why is it that they're always using their positions to make sure that these rural counties in particular are so lawless? Why are they so eager to bend over backwards to protect the criminals who are right in front of them? Well, for that answer, you need look no further than Gibson County, Tennessee. This place is basically the poster child for the kind of rural reprobates that I'm constantly telling you about. Now, a guy named Paul Thomas got himself elected sheriff of Gibson County as an independent. Now, what needs to be remembered is that he's actually aligned with the Republicans, but the local GOP candidates had more support than he did, so he positioned himself as a disruptor of sorts. And his political pivot worked. But like most of these crooks, he wanted to go into politics so that he could engage in the same old kind of dirty dealings. In 2020, now Sheriff Thomas and some friends started 3 businesses together, which they would use in order to get money from the government and put it in their own pockets. One of them was a so-called staffing company called Alliance Staffing Group. They should have called it Unholy Alliance Staffing. They were allegedly set up to provide staffing to local businesses. What they did was to lend out inmates at the jail to work on behalf of unscrupulous business figures like the ones that Thomas was partnered up with. Instead of having the inmates' wages deposited into an inmate trust account like he was supposed to, Sheriff Thomas decided to take the inmates' wages and deposit it into a private account owned and controlled by the Alliance Group. And that's just the money that they bothered to track down, $448,000. You know it had to be far more than that. Well, you can't have slaves without slave quarters, so Sheriff Thomas and his pals also set up a second company called Orchard House Transitional Home, which was supposed to provide housing for these prisoners. Now, Orchard House is one of these so-called faith-based organizations, so when you see the white right talking about how they want more faith-based initiatives, that means to use the church as a clumsy front for these money schemes. When Orchard House opened, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee himself toured the facility, and he said it was an example of what he wanted to do statewide. So this place had the personal stamp of approval of the governor. He knew about it. Sheriff Thomas allowed 74 Tennessee Department of Corrections inmates held in the Gibson County Jail to reside at Orchard House without proper approval from a judge. The indictment says that he continued to show the jail as being the inmate location when the reality was they were actually over at Orchard House. But that didn't stop Sheriff Thomas from having the county collect over $500,000 in reimbursements from the State Department of Corrections. Sheriff Thomas then ordered that the county give that money to his Orchard House without the state agency's knowledge or consent. Now, of course, we know nothing happens in a vacuum under white supremacy, so when they say things were done without their consent, that means we deny all knowledge of this dirt that we had full knowledge of. Remember, the governor himself had gone out to Orchard House, and he praised it as a model for the state. So how is it that nobody knew? The state comptroller's office said that Orchard House was neither attached to the jail nor staffed by jail personnel, and no contract existed between the county and Orchard House. So this guy was setting up front companies to act as a big net for government contracts and an embezzlement scheme. These are red state values here. Sheriff Thomas also didn't disclose his ownership interest in Alliance in his annual filings with the Tennessee Ethics Commission, but the words ethics and Tennessee don't belong in the same sentence to begin with. Now keep in mind, he wasn't supposed to be able to do this without a judge signing off on it. So there's been no oversight Or more than likely, the judge was in on it. You know how these good old boys are. These inbreds all know each other. They're all related to each other. Their family trees are one gigantic knot. And the white media out there had to have known. But they said nothing until indictments were handed down, and they're already in the process of downplaying it. Now, if a black politician sneezes, they get arrested or indicted and it's national news. You got guys like the Sheriff Thomas, though, running around having whole slavery rings, and it's treated as a one-and-done story and forgotten. Not surprisingly, Massa Thomas, the plantation owner, won re-election in 2022. And that was about the time when the feds finally awoke from their coma long enough to actually look into all the dirt he'd been doing. Surprisingly, he's been arrested and indicted in 2 separate counties, Gibson and Davidson, on at least 22 charges including forgery, computer crimes, and theft. Now, before we go any further, he should have been indicted on slavery charges too. The 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The operative term there being except, which we all know nullifies everything that came before it in a sentence. So the 13th Amendment ought to read, slavery and involuntary punishment for crime shall exist within the United States and anywhere subject to its jurisdiction, because that's certainly the way that it's played out in practice. Slavery was a public and private sector institution, but under the 13th Amendment it was restricted to only a state institution. So John White couldn't own black people anymore, but Uncle Sam could, as could the local sheriffs, which is why chain gangs proliferated after Reconstruction, and the U.S. government has done nothing about it. But as we've seen, even private white citizens can get in on the act, and they have, having their own private plantations with black children being on them. Neither those 2 animals in West Virginia nor this rotten sheriff have been indicted on charges of enslaving anyone. You notice that? In fact, when have you ever heard of anyone being indicted for violating the 13th Amendment? All you get is some unlawful imprisonment law, but who has ever been arrested or charged with violating the 13th Amendment? Does it happen? And yet we have case after case after case of it happening today. Slavery in the U.S. Not in the 1930s or 40s or 50s, but today in the 21st century. Slavery didn't go away. And this is why we're owed reparations. When slavery rings can freely operate, the authorities at the state level can be fully aware of it, and people can run from state to state with black children as their prisoners. When sheriffs are also doing the exact same things, this is not some anomaly. This is state policy. And only an idiot needs for it to be spelled out or for someone to come up with a confession for it. Now, we're told as black people all the time that slavery's been over for 150 years, and black people have nothing to be aggrieved about. Slavery is gone. Racism's all but dead. Where in America do you see anyone owning black people as property? And yet we keep seeing example after example after example like these. And these are just the ones that have come to light. You know, there's a ton of others that even the white media has been able to successfully bury. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down, or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by. Keep that leaf blower at the ready, and always carry your steel. Power Tools, because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. Not surprisingly, this Sheriff Thomas guy isn't the first good old boy sheriff to be indicted from that area. In fact, just a few years ago, another Gibson County Sheriff, Chuck Arnold, pleaded guilty to charges including fraud, theft, forgery, and official misconduct related to the taking of drugs and money from a jail medication fund. So criminality is not just some anomaly at the Gibson County Sheriff's Office, it's a job requirement. Oh, by the way, on a side note, former Sheriff Arnold, he didn't see a day in prison. He was just simply sentenced to probation. This guy was convicted of fraud, theft, forgery, taking drugs, embezzlement, and all they gave him was mere probation. No jail time. And these are the same Republicans who talk about being tough on crime and how prosecutors have to stop giving criminals a slap on the wrist. Yet no Republican will talk about mandatory sentences for police misconduct. But then again, neither will the Democrats. And we all know why. Supporting police criminality is a bipartisan issue. Because both parties understand the real purpose the police serve, serving white supremacy and protecting the racial pecking order. And that it's done through violence. If the thugs in blue begin getting the idea that their extrajudicial murders and targeting of black people is no longer allowed, then the violence necessary to keep black people in check simply won't be there. And that's something that I need black people to understand. What is the law? Sure, it's a set of rules, but I mean, what is the law in practice? The state has a monopoly on the use of violence, or at least it tries to make sure that it does. That's important because the law is a list of things that the state says it's willing to put violence behind. That's the reason why even though civil law and criminal law often have different penalties, the one thing both civil and criminal law have in common is that at some point the state is going to send some knuckle-dragging degenerates with badges and guns to come after you if you're deemed to have broken those laws, or in the case of civil laws, if you don't pay whatever cost a court has ordered you to pay. That's what gives the law teeth. The understanding that the state can use its monopoly on violence to enforce whatever they put on the books. But of course, with black people, this state monopoly on violence goes way beyond that. We are targeted, assaulted, and routinely murdered for no offense at all. And it's people like this Thomas character who do it. And then you have judges who make it a point not to punish them. Yes, they see this as being a big perk of their job, but the level of psychopathic devotion they give to it indicates that for them, this has a far deeper meaning. Protecting police misconduct is a reinforcement of their racial double standard. This is how they reassure one another that they're on code and that the system of racial goodies, giveaways, and guarantees they've put in place for themselves is still standing. And the white media's job is to ignore or excuse their criminality because they're the propaganda arm of white supremacy, and if they undercut the thugs in blue, or if they do reporting that causes changes to be made, then the system collapses. So the white media has to do damage control when these creeps get caught, and the rest of the time they just cover for them, or rather cover up. This is why the reputation of the police is in the toilet, and has always been so. The contempt the public holds for them is very well deserved. People aren't stupid. Even the ones who talk about that back the badge crap, which are mostly police or people closely related to them. You know the type. People who routinely depend on their inbred family members who are in law enforcement to get rid of traffic tickets for them or to get them out of a jam. They know what's really going on. The police who go into policing by and large don't do it to serve the community. They do it to serve themselves. You work a cushy little safe job for 20 years and you get to retire early. Most folks have to put in 40 years to get a pension, not the police. 20 years usually is enough. Then they go on and do some other job once they're in their 40s for another 20 years. So basically by the time they actually quote-unquote retire, they've essentially got 3 pensions from 2 jobs and Social Security. It's a mutual protection racket. But the people being protected aren't the public. Even the idiots who talk that Blue Lives Matter garbage, the people being protected are these criminal sheriffs, crooked judges, and law-breaking prosecutors. These felons are committed only to protecting themselves. Now, this may come as a surprise to most of America what's been going on, but that's because most of America isn't black. We can't expect them to understand the daily realities we have to deal with, and this is because they're the beneficiaries of all this anti-black racism. And just like in the past, everybody benefited from it. Everybody got bank off of black people's suffering. How many of the businesses that benefit from the black slave labor of today are owned by people of color? See, that was also a fixture of American slavery, too. Remember, those reprobates in West Virginia, they were forcing those black kids to do labor for somebody, so someone was paying them for it. It's naive to the point of stupidity to think that these people didn't know where this free labor was coming from. This is why you better start getting bold about reparations. Don't be sheepish about it. Don't be shy. And don't worry about hurting someone else's feelings, because nobody ever sheds a tear about ours. Joe Biden certainly isn't talking about it, and it's not just the senility stopping him either. It's because this is state policy. Biden and the Democrats know full well that if they admit slavery's alive and kicking in the U.S. today, then they have validated the reparations argument. And this is all about stopping that one in its tracks. So it's out of sight, out of mind. Negro Jim Clyburn, America's favorite sharecropper and the alleged most powerful black politician in America, hasn't said boo about it. The Congressional Black Caucus isn't talking about the enslavement of black children, but they were ready to jump out a window about the treatment of illegal alien children on the border. They haven't said one word about the treatment of black children who are citizens right here in the U.S. Now, when you got all these white supremacists running around enslaving black people like it was the 1860s, then it's time to ask, what did people like Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, and John Brown do to put an end to it? Black people have to understand that if we're dealing with 19th century behavior, maybe a 19th century solution is what's required. Or you can just wait until Sheriff Thomas's successor decides to put a stop to it, though he may be too busy embezzling money to even bother. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Arlaz, Ikegas Dorset, Alice Ransom, Glenda Tice, and Kenneth Prescia. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.